So it's for Article 2 of the Manchette cuts. This term is borrowed from the espadon because we haven't worn cuffs, manchettes, don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, for a long time. It designates the cuts with which you can wound the opponent's right arm and, in consequence, disarm him, as there aren't other disarms in sabre. There are 3 in contrapoint. The first one, which we will call outside manchette, cut because it cuts to both sides of the body. That is to say, the side of the chest, which is like the thrust inside the arms, and the side of the back to the outside. It is the same with the arm. The manchette cut is formed outside, being engaged in court and making a circle above the opponent's point. Comes to cut the right side of his forearm by bending ever so subtly the body on the right leg without lunging. That's one image. The manchette cut is formed inside, being engaged in tierce with the opponent, following along his blade by cutting back his arm perpendicularly, if not his wrist. So this manchette cut to the inside and parry. What we call the reverse manchette cut is done thus. The hand reverses as it's giving it by making a complete circle with the sabre and cutting all the length of the underside of the forearm of the opponent. The 3 cuts have the same advantage of not being made without lunging and consequently without engaging under the enemy's sword. That's that. All right.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm just going to pull my earpiece out. But yeah, this is sort of, I find this really interesting because one of the things I sort of noticed with Sabre, and one of the things that really helped me understand Sabre was going, oh, well, the easiest thing to do is just cut the other person in the sword arm and that wins the fight. And then I kind of realized that a lot of British Sabre, like the way you hold guards, kind of the ways you cut, is basically set up to prevent that. But a lot of English language manuals don't really talk about arm cuts, or if they do, it's in a very supplementary way. Like Hutton does, but he only does it in Cold Steel. Actually, I think he does in the Swordsman as well, but he only does it in his manuals where he just doesn't shut up. But if you ask him to write something concise, he doesn't talk about arm cuts. Whereas I think Burton actually says this is a core aspect of French cut and thrust sword, that they, the first thing that they learn after basic techniques, or even in this case, before basic techniques, is is to attack the arm. I'll be very interested to hear if that's true, as someone who has read very little in the way of French manuals, but heard a lot of the contemporary English people talking about it. The first one of these is kind of a favorite of mine. So one of my favorite tricks when I'm doing Sabre is to come to a cart guard, get my opponent to engage, and as soon as they engage, just lift the tip over and basically transition my weight. Or I don't know, I tend to just lean. But what he seems to be suggesting is once you get up to here, I don't think he's suggesting a full movement, and not just because it will hit the roof, because it will hit my roof, but just as a very, very quick way to do this. You basically lift up, just does make a small circle, but you basically lift your sword up until you've cleared your opponent's sword and come straight forward. And this is also, I think, kind of why it's advantageous to be backweighted, is you can launch yourself forward and get a lot of power from just a weight transition and just come in. And instantly, this is why you don't really see cart guards in later Sabre systems. They don't like them because it's really vulnerable to this. Just straight up and bang, straight down on the arm. So that's sort of the first of his manchette cuts. The second is pretty much the opposite way. You lift up and then just transition straight forward, which is something. This is actually in other manuals that talk about attacking the sword arm. They say this is a much, much harder cut to carry because the shell will get in the way. Whereas, if you're looking, I'll come a close to the camera so you can see. If you see how much of my arm you can see when I'm in cart versus tierce. Like my arm is a lot more concealed, so it's a lot harder to get a hit on. Whereas with cart, you can see pretty much the whole thing. And then, But exact same principle of just using basically a weight transition to get all of your power and making very small movement with the tip. I know he does describe it as a circle, but I suspect it's a very small circle, something like this, because that will greatly boost the chances of you actually landing it. Whereas doing this, like a big kind of, sort of horizontal Mornay, is much more telegraphic. And the third, this is kind of another favorite of mine. I'm actually really liking this system. I think he has similar preferences to me, which I approve of. Is just full Mornay rising cut straight to the arm, and obviously weight transition. But a lot of the power coming of this is coming doing this sort of full circle straight up. So yeah, fairly simple techniques. I quite like them. I think attacking to the sword arm is a very, very important skill, because if you're good at attacking to the sword arm, and you can basically harass your opponent's sword arm until they get good at defending their sword arm and fencing from those defenses. There's not a lot they can do. So yeah, it's kind of this cool way of setting the pace of the fight, which I think is why it's like the first thing in the manual. But yeah, so it's kind of that's kind of my take on that. If anyone wants to correct me, and again, don't be afraid to just be like, to just tell me I'm wrong, because I'm new to this. But yeah, that's kind of my take. And so yeah, if anyone has any comments, just now's the time. Or even if people agree with me, I need to stop talking, and no one is here to throw something at me to shut me up.
Do you suspect some of the reason attacks to the sword arm don't appear prominently in brief manuals is because it's sort of assumed knowledge, and that we expect you to know how to counter these, so let's teach you beyond that?
No, I think it's the opposite. I think it's because the brief sword manuals only teach the very basics. And I think what the assumption is attacks the sword arm are not as important if you already know what you're doing. Like, as Jacob and Kira can attest, when we're fencing the old sword club and we can actually physically meet, there comes a point where I don't really attack. I don't get a lot of hits on sword arms when people kind of become familiar with the system. So usually I find when I'm fencing, if I'm fencing someone, a beginner or someone who's done a less forearm snipey system, a lot of my hits on them will be on the sword arm. But when they're kind of either used to fencing me and doing something else, or even doing like late 19th century British sabre, hits to the sword arm become a lot rarer. So I think the assumption is basically if you're holding your guards correctly and you're cutting correctly, it's not much of an issue. But there's not the sense that you need to be made to be good at defending your sword arm through having your sword arm repeatedly hit. Whereas I think this might be like a pedagogical approach, because in Burton, who draws very, very heavily from French counterpoint, he says once you've learnt the basics, once you know the basic techniques, the first thing you need to learn is how to attack the sword arm, is playing Manchette. And it kind of uses the same term. Yeah.
Yes. Something I find interesting in this is that you have this the contrepoint garde. It's basically tierce, very forward, and that's something that you can see in Saint Martin Espadon. Is that the hand is almost at shoulder height, and the fact that it's that high in tierce means that the coup de manchette doesn't, on tierce at least, doesn't work when you just go above the saber, because the arm is straight, and if you go above the saber, you will just hit nothing. And that's why I think his coup de manchette en dehors from the outside, it doesn't go above the saber, it just slides along the saber of the the opponent, and then just at the end makes like a 90 degrees and cuts to the arm.
Yeah, you can't come over the top.
Yeah.
There is a slight exception to that, which is if you are much taller than your opponent.
Yeah, of course.
Which I know from experience.
This I have learned the hard way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point. That's why it's probably also why he has a single rising cut. Like he's not relying on, he's got the sort of the two or very high cuts, like basically 1, 2, but he's also got a rising cut because the guard is so high. Which I find quite interesting. I suspect also like there's also kind of an implicit assumption that your sword will be engaged. Because I find with extended guards, if you don't have an engagement, having a very extended guard can leave your sword arm vulnerable. But if you are engaged, or you form engagement, even if you're not like swords don't cross, but you've got your sword on that line, the correct line, you're fairly well protected, and it means you can stand fairly close to your opponent and still have to be able to hit you quickly.
Yeah. The feeling I got by reading most French, some French manuals is that really you have to be engaged. It's there are some people saying the same thing with longsword, that the hard thing is to read your opponent, and this is what we see with this. I mean, most of the time, Saint Martin begins like that. You start the sparring by engaging your weapon, and then you try to understand what he's doing, and so that's basically, yes, I believe that you start engaged. And also when you have an arm extended like that, it's actually really hard to find an opening because this is like maximum distance between your body and the enemy. So I find that as he said, the garde de contrepoint is actually really good when dealing with an opponent to keep safe.
It sort of kind of keeps them at bay, or means if they do get close. Sort of it's interesting, like this sort of artificial lengthening where even though that your opponent is physically close to you, they have to maneuver, like they have to bring their sword around yours, which kind of artificially slows it down. Which is quite interesting.
It's interesting that he makes a distinction between engaged and tiers, but not for the reverse. He just has the one reverse.
Yeah, he only mentions cart once. That I don't know about French system or French system period, but it becomes quite normal that in Sabre later that you don't, like, cart engagements are very rarely mentioned. Like even Hutton, who tries to list everything in Cold Steel, only very briefly touches on cart engagements. So in my this is probably actually a Damien question. Is it, do you see cart engagements commonly in other French systems?
Saint Martin is only cart engagements. It doesn't on horse there are tierce engagements, but he says on foot you do cart. And we have a lot of problems with that. Well, this is just me speaking. Maxime probably has another opinion, but you have a lot of occurrences of this. He tells you how to do something one way on one side, but never on the other, and then you just wonder is it not done, or can you just do it? And I think it's a case by case situation where you have to see if it works or not.
Yeah.
How frustrating.
Well, welcome to interpretation work. Where, like you know, that's, I mean, that's kind of the thing is, you know, half the time you're trying to work out what they've not said, but you should probably know anyway. So I think that's very true of, you know, of really all systems. So are there any other comments on Manchette, or are we good to move on?
Well, just to bring up like the very last, the last few sentences in this, where he's just mentioning, and I've been thinking about this while we've been talking. I wrote this book only to serve as a guide to general officers of the cavalry who would wish to instruct the art of fencing to their divisions, as well as any amateur who would already have learned the art of the triangular sword, or for any student guided by good masters. So he really specifies during a lot of this, like, no, you should already know what swords do, and this is how I do it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be curious to know the original, because it'd be interesting. There's an interesting question here, whether he's saying this is, you know, what I think you should teach if you already know how to fight with this weapon, or what if he's saying is this is what, you know, this is for people who want to learn contrapoint fencing who already know how to do foil, because something we mentioned earlier is when they use the word sword,